it's great to be here tonight in New York. I see a few familiar faces have joined. For those who I haven't met, my name is Logan Koffler. I've been a member of the Jewish community for what feels like probably a decade now. I'll be moderating, but please feel free to submit some questions to the chat box. I'm also happy to unmute your mic and you can ask them directly. I think before we get started, it's important to pause for a second to really take a look at the backdrop of this session and of this conference. Racism and anti-Semitism are once again on the rise. We're seeing acts of racism and anti-Semitism increasingly normalized here in the US, and what appears to be a new license to spew hate coming from the very top of the US. If you look at the numbers, the Anti-Defamation League recorded the highest level of anti-Semitic incidents this year since they were started, I think back in the late 1970s. Gabrielle, if you're on the group chat, shared a stat that was relatively shocking, and that is, according to the FBI, 60% of hate crimes have been directed towards religious groups, have been directed towards Jews, which is actually just quite frightening. And as we've all seen, these horrific images of police brutality against Black communities, a pattern that has existed for a long time, but now has been broadcast into our living rooms, have been very difficult to see. I think despite what we're seeing, the relationship between Jewish communities and Black communities needs work. That's the impetus or the catalyst to this session today. And my hope is that this can be a conversation where we're honest and transparent about the work that needs to get done. So in that vein, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Katya Mevorach. The professor brings to us today not only her fascinating life experiences, but a deep understanding and connection between anti-Semitism and racism. Professor Mevorach was mother was born in Vienna, Austria, and became a refugee when her grandparents were able to escape Nazi-occupied Austria in 1938. On the other side of the Atlantic, Professor Mevorach's father was born in Jamaica, and the two met and married at a time when interracial marriages were frowned upon within the Jewish community. The professor moved to Israel in 1970 after graduating from the Grinnell School in New York, and returned to the US in 1991 to pursue doctoral studies at Duke University. She was invited to join Grinnell College as a scholar in residence in January 1996, and went on to serve as chair of the Africana Studies concentration from 1996 to 2000, and later as chair of an expanded American Studies concentration. She is the author of the book, Black, Jewish, and Interracial. It's not the color of your skin, but the race of your kin, and other myths of identity. So with that, I wanted just to turn it over to Professor for 10 or 15 minutes of presentation, and then we'll move over to Q&A. Professor, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening. For some of you, it's very late. It's been a long day. I've been teaching at this hour during the pandemic period. We have options. So I put my timer on for 10 minutes. And since it's not an open audience, I can't see anybody, I will rely on my timer to turn me off. And I'm going to turn to slides, because I think slides is more interesting than looking at me, PowerPoint, which is not something I normally do. So I want to start off with 3 points to a question, and that is, has anti-Semitism become a non-issue, even though the topic of your whole sessions are about anti-Semitism. In fact, anti-Semitism as a specific discussion had disappeared, and quite frankly, in a lot of college campuses, I'm on a college campus, this is not a top priority. And why is that so? And this is the thesis of everything that I will say, even if I don't get through the PowerPoint. One is the rise of, you know what? I don't think I shared my screen. Let me backtrack. And it should, yes, okay. One is the rise of whiteness studies. This begins and reaches its apex in the early 2000s, mid 2000. The second was the rise of Islamophobia. And under Islamophobia, I did not add, but I will add in a few minutes, the question of Palestinian Israelis and Palestinians who are not Israelis. Palestinians are in what were called the occupied territories, and by some are still called the occupied territories in Hebrew and in other languages, or Judea and Samaria if one is on the right side, on the right, capital R, of the political spectrum. And the third, as a consequence of the first two, was the beginning of the absence of Jews from multicultural topics. And this is particularly important in the United States. So much of what I have to say is true around the globe, but it is especially true in the United States. South Africa would be a variant of number 3, and England, I think, is on the cusp. And I don't think this is necessarily the topic in France or Italy at all. So I start out, and so I'm going to put it on the background of teaching. Yes, so for me, this is part of the strategies of moving forward, but particularly when it's young people who are in college and college age. One thing which is completely forgotten, which is overlooked, which has become just polemic or rhetoric or pulled out of the hat when it's convenient, is that Jews are actually a global people, okay? So Jews perhaps don't dress this way anymore because we're in the 21st century and people around the globe are looking at similar fashions. They all see Vanity Fair or Vogue or GI. This is no longer something unusual, but we need to remember and we need to promote the idea that Jews are a global people. In that context, then there is a Jewish diaspora. On this particular map, which I use with my students in particular, it's not complete, it's just one of many maps, but here we get a sense of a different way of looking at the globe. This is not Eurocentric, right? This is Jews begin in the East, and then they move out. So questions about who the Jews are, what are Jewish identities, raise questions about assimilation, difference, and belonging. Are Jews part of a country? Are Jews separate? Do Jews describe themselves as American and leave out the word Jews? Or do they say American Jews? Or do they say Jewish Americans? Or do they say Jewish and American? And American you can use with different countries. The other part, and this is particularly important, I think, in conversations with a younger generation of both Black Americans and Jewish Americans, and Black Americans, I'm referring to those who are not Jewish, yes? And Jewish Americans who are Jewish and may belong to other groups, is the idea that there is such a thing as white Jews, and then there are the other Jews. And that is a particularly problematic paradigm that has become normalized, naturalized, institutionalized, so that the idea that Jews are white is taken for granted, and then we have the exceptions. And one of the challenges here is that the new anti-Semitism, which confuses criticism of the Israeli government with questioning the right of Israel to exist, is a problem both of conceptualization and of vocabulary. So if we go back to 1967, I don't think one can simplify this too much. One goes back to 1967 as a random date. That is a date where there is both the Six-Day War, but also a break within what was called the Jewish Black Alliance Coalition, and which was always problematic as a reference because it was not always a love affair. And it was never a love affair with all groups of people who were in the Black community and in the Jewish community. But 1967 is about the time that Israel comes to be thought of as a colonial and described as a colonial outpost of Europe. Colonial outpost then meant Western, and Western meant white. It takes place over several decades. Part of the problem then is that one never sees Jews of different countries and what they look like. So are these Jews? Most of my students, when they see this picture, they say, oh, they're Arabs, but these are Jews. Well, when did Jews stop being Arab or European or Levantine? Also, most Black Americans, most Jewish Americans no longer know that the idea of the ghetto does not arise in urban America. It begins in Venice. It's the first time the term is used. And it is a form of apartheid where Jews had to go into separate Jewish neighborhoods and were not allowed out after dark. So I think that it's very important, at least for those who are working on coalition building at the grassroots level, to be aware of historical context, even if one can't always map out that full context to a lay population, in other words, to a non-academic, in a non-academic environment. But one thing which is completely forgotten is that the vocabulary of race as a noun is very much a part of the 19th century. And in the 19th century, all human beings were divided into race categories. And in the United States, when Jews arrived, they arrived and were listed as members of the Hebrew race. Before I turn to an example of that, we can go back, and what most Americans and many younger people around the world, but I would say in the United States, it's most marked, whereas in Europe, there's enough references and reminders of World War II, so it hasn't completely disappeared from people's collective memory. But in Germany, the Nuremberg laws actually divided Jews up and divided by race. And race was always about ancestry. Race was never defined by appearance. Not in America during slavery and not after, always by ancestry. So here is, I have a cousin who discovered me. We share the same great-grandparents. She's in Vienna, but she only found out that she was Jewish when her grandfather died. This is my mother's port of entry certificate. And you will see, I think you can see here, nationality is Hebrew. Place of origin is Germany because Austria was under German rule. But nationality, Hebrew. Hebrew was the reference for Jews. I also point out to my students and to others consistently that Jews don't begin in Europe. Jews begin in the East, and that there was a very vibrant Jewish community throughout North Africa and the Middle East, most of whom had to leave after 1948. So to the question of are Jews white in the aggregate, is interesting to send people, and yourselves, all the diplomats, should go and listen to this case, not read the case, and not just read the transcript, but listen to the case, the oral argument, along with reading the transcript. Because the transcript reminds us that in 1987, there is no discussion of Jews as an ethnic group. It's not there. The whole case relies on whether or not the desecration, the defamation of a synagogue could be prosecuted under civil rights. And it was tied with a case that I'm not going to get into. It tied with a case with an Arab Iraqi. And so all of the justices ask and Thurgood Marshall is on this, all the justices ask very pertinent questions about, well, are Jews a race? And the defense and the prosecuting lawyers, they don't really want to answer that question. They keep sliding around the question, and all the justices come back to it. But the bottom line was that the decision was made that, yes, Jews could argue for racial discrimination because in the 19th century, in the United States, Jews were seen as a racial group. And how does one know that? Not by the color of one's skin, but by iconic symbols like the Nazi graffiti that had been put on the synagogue. So it wasn't a case of simple vandalism. It was a case of an anti-Semitic act. But what's interesting, as I say, is the way in which Jews have to be defined and the justices' questioning and the answers that Patricia Brennan provides, and her skirting away and trying to argue that Jews are white and then being called by Thurgood Marshall into question, and also by Justice Scalia. Well, wait a second, are Jews white? But what about Jews who are Black? What about the Jews of Harlem? Remember Thurgood Marshall, some of you may know, was from Harlem. In fact, he lived in my building when I was a child, very small, before he moved to DC. So is political anti-Semitism a side effect of whiteness studies? Well, If one looks at a picture like this, only those who are of an older generation, and when I say older now, I really mean people who are over the age of 70 and some who have died out, that the caricature of Jews was not a white person. It was somebody who was a racial other, who was not part of the Anglo-Saxon community. And so we have in 1967, once Jews begin to be upwardly mobile, one has James Baldwin writing an article in the New York Times in which he asks, have Jews become so assimilated? Have they become really a white person? In effect, a Christian. And so you can look this up. It started to recirculate this particular article, which interestingly enough was quite controversial in '67. We then have a series of books which come out in the 1990s, all excellent, two of which are the most important, in my opinion, for anybody interested in, again, North America and specifically the United States, is to read Karen Brodkin's How Jews Became White Folks. Again, the title as a reminder that Jews were not always seen as white, including by Black Americans and including today. But that's not true for a younger generation. That is only true for an older generation. And Matthew Fry Jacobson, who this book is probably the best book on the way in which whiteness as a racial identity becomes popularized in such a way that those who are under the age of 40 don't think of themselves as anything but white if they happen to have white skin. And if they happen to have white skin, of course they have white privilege. And then one can speak about whiteness and privilege. The problem, as I identify it, is at the moment one learns to see not Jewish as everybody who is not white in color, in appearance, one begins to assume that, of course, Jews are white and forgets that depending on where one is in the world, these images are not particularly funny. And these images were ubiquitous in New York subways in the 1960s. Just give me a couple of more seconds, show a couple of more images just to have something in mind to play with. This is an image which is on the cover of a book, Jewish Multiculturalism. Interestingly enough, if you remove the kippah, you actually cannot know whether in 2020, are these two Syrians who are Muslim? Are these two Iraqis who are Christian? Are these two Druze? Are these two people Jews? Where are they from? We don't know. We know only because of the kippah on the head. But what country do they come from? That we don't know. So should we call them white Jews? I don't think so. We had Frantz Fanon, an important psychiatrist, Black psychiatrist, political thinker, often invoked, especially in post-colonial studies. This particular paragraph is rarely invoked except by those who are doing anti-racist work, which was when Fanon said, he was taught, no, it's not just that Jews are equal human beings like Blacks, but rather anyone who is anti-Semite is also ultimately anti-Black. And so I'll just close this so that there's plenty of time for talking and then I can expand on anything. I've spoken quickly, my alarm went off a few minutes ago. In 2015, this was reprinted in the Washington Post. Rabbi Gil Steinlauf said, Jews in America struggled for decades to become white. Now we must give up whiteness. Let's teach our children that we are in fact not white, but simply Jewish. I want to just contextualize that last sentence by pointing out that I see two problems in some of the discussions with young Black Lives Matter and also young, whether they are Black American or whether they are Jewish American or whether they are now second generation Jewish American whose parents immigrated from Israel or from France or from England, but their origins are North Africa and the Middle East. In other words, that they are Mizrahi and not just Ashkenazi. It's funny because I'm Ashkenazi and my husband, whose mother was from Algeria and his father was sixth generation Jerusalem, he's blonde and green eyes, but I'm the Ashkenazi and he's the Mizrahi. But one of the things that is often forgotten is the fact that the Holocaust, which affected my family, I am named for my great-grandmother who was murdered in the camps, and my grandfather had to say goodbye to her. And I don't remember him as he loved me very much, and he was always proud of me. And they had a chicken farm in Farmingdale, New Jersey, which was also Klan country. Those of you who know anything about the chicken farmers in Farmingdale. But he went to Israel, he went to Palestine in 33, and he came back and he said, I wish I could go. That's what our people look like. So he comes back to Vienna and he says, not us pale-faced people, but because he had met so many Yemeni Jews in Jerusalem, this is what we really look like. Part of the problem, I believe, is that too much of the emphasis on American Jewish and Black American coalitions is a starting point of the Shoah, as if Jewish history began with the Shoah, and the Shoah has its counterpart in Persia, and that is Purim, but we don't mention that. And secondly, the assumption that Jews are white and that Jews have always been white. And now in 2020, a generation that does not remember the 1960s, that did not live through the 1960s, either as a grown-up, an adult participant, or as the child of activists, are trying to bring back a nostalgia of the 60s that cannot speak to the kids who are under 40. In fact, my age gives me away, but in fact, under the age of 50. Those who are under the age of 50 were born around 1970. They can't have a memory of nostalgia, which is beautifully mapped out in Shared Legacies, a film which you're going to be seeing, I think, this week. And I will compare it, and with that I will end and open it up for you to ask questions, and perhaps it's even a dialogue because it's not 50 people, it's only 17. But if you compare, and if you've seen it already, Shared Legacies with the movie Selma by Ava DuVernay, where Abraham Heschel is not in it. And there was a big debate over the absence of a Jewish presence in her film, and her pushback in saying this was not a film about Jews, this was a film about Blacks and social justice and civil rights. The answers have to be more complex, and I believe that one way to make the answers more complex is to change both the images which are promoted, not to make Jews who are not visibly white unique members or unique speakers, but integrated in ways that include Jews from Ethiopia, Jews of Moroccan background, Jews of Iraqi background, seamlessly, not as something which is special. And secondly, not to assume that all Black Americans are not Jewish. So I will leave it with that. I have lots more to say, but I think that's enough to give you kind of an opening, provocative opening. Palestinians cannot be ignored in this discussion. There is no way to speak to young Black people or to young American Jews and ignore the issue of Palestinians. And I say that as somebody who is refusing to give up a belief in Zionism as the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, even if it's been actualized in Israel. And some of my Israeli friends who are on the left have since said, we need to get rid of the term Zionist as an identity label. I don't happen to agree yet. So I will stop there and take questions.
Well, thank you, Professor, and a fascinating presentation. I do want to maybe as the first question explore a little bit deeper this notion of Jews and whiteness. And as we just heard, and I know you speak about this in your lectures, this association of whiteness is really only a more recent phenomenon. If this is in fact the case, if Jews' whiteness or perceived whiteness is perhaps contributing to anti-Semitism, what do we do about it? Do we reverse the clock? Do we, as I think you highlighted a quote, do we give up our whiteness, and how?
So I think that is a very pertinent question. So I don't have I'm not going to share a picture of my children right now. You can Google it, you can find it on your own. Obviously, if you are in America, if you're in the United States, if you are, and I'm going to say the United States, if you're in the United States and you look white, if you look visibly white and you have no accessories, nothing on your body to indicate that you are either a Muslim or Jewish or Buddhist. I can't think of other religions right now. And if you've grown up in the United States, you've also grown up with something else, which I didn't say, which is the idea that Jewishness is a religion. This idea that we're talking about religious discrimination rather than a people. So this is my answer. Number one, strategically, one has to just forge forward and change one's vocabulary without my historical context. So I think you had a different title to this workshop. I don't remember it because I'm not going to look the email up. And I said, oh, I don't think this is the best title for the workshop. And you all went back and you discussed it. And in fact, the title changed. That's making a difference. I'm involved with another discussion someplace else. And I'm going to come to your question about whiteness. And the title was Black Jews. And I said, I can't participate if it's Black Jews. I can participate if it's people who are Black and Jewish, which allows someone to say, but I am white. I walk around the world and I'm seen as white. That's white passing. That's a new term that the younger students that I have started using, which is new to me, but they say white passing. I think that to say I am white, I have access to white privilege, as long as I don't say who I am, that's white passing. That's acknowledging privilege. But it's the same time, by using the conjunction and, it acknowledges that Jewishness is a different identity. It is separate. It is not the same thing. Jews are people. Jews are a nation. And within that group, there are people who are ultra-Orthodox and who are supporters of Trump, and I don't want to accept them in my home. And then there are people who are on the far left, and I don't necessarily want to invite Judith Butler to dinner, okay? So there are those who deny the existence and don't want Israel to exist. But it's that idea of a racial identity, of white as a racial identity, that I am suggesting that on the ground as a strategy. One doesn't have to explain it, one simply starts to say it. So in the 1990s, I had a student check it out. The term white Jews became ubiquitous in Jewish media, beginning with the forward, rather than resisting the temptation to say, as a white Jew, as a Black Jew. No, you say as a Moroccan Jew, as a Canadian Jew, as someone who is white and Jewish. That allows for two distinct ways of presenting oneself in the public.
Great, thank you for that. And I see Zach Silverberg has wrote in the Zoom group chat. Zach, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to unmute you, and if you can just ask the question, because it's a long one over the conference call here, that would be great.
Thanks, Logan. And Dr. Mevorach, thank you so much for your time. It's really a pleasure to hear from you. As a Canadian and white passing person and a Jew, I recognize that I have a lot of privilege, and I think that this is a really important conversation to have, and one that we're certainly having in our community here. Something that my friends and I have noticed and have been talking about recently is, if I walk into a Jewish communal organization or a shul or something, even if I'm not wearing a kippah or whatever, I'm automatically accepted as, oh yeah, he looks Jewish enough, he probably belongs here. Who do you know? Whereas if a person of color walks into a shul or a communal organization or whatever, the first question invariably asked of them is, what brings you here? So as to put a barrier or to other the person before they even are accepted as being, quote, one of us. It's something that I've been knocking around with my friends a lot. What can we do? How can we change this culture?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I don't have an easy answer for that. That is one of the biggest dilemmas, that there is not an easy answer. And I left for Israel when I was 18. And I will say this, in 1970, when I left for Israel, the United States was in the midst of the Vietnam War. the tension between Blacks on campuses and Jews on campuses was such that for many, we forget that there are a lot of people who are Black and Jewish who come out of those marriages of a Jewish mother or a Black mother and a Jewish parent and a Black parent. But when the mother is Jewish, there was never a question. So there's a whole generation, not many at that time, today many. And what do you do when you take your child to synagogue and you know that all eyes are going to be on the child? That would have been my example. But I was raised to simply look people in the eye and say, are you Jewish? So, that is not an easy thing. It's about how do we reprogram Black Americans, and this will be my example, analogous, it's not quite the same. But when segregation ended and Blacks were able to move out of segregated areas, the color range in the neighborhoods also changed. In the South, those who looked white were described as, they look white, but they're really Black, or they're really a Negro was the language of the time. You could pass until you said your ancestry. It is true that in the United States, unlike in Israel, where the diversity is bigger and there's all kinds of ethnic issues in Israel, not quite the way it is in the United States, although America has provided a lot of critical race theory, the vocabulary, the paradigms have been exported. How do you, Zach, how do you answer the question? How do you make a cultural shift? I would say this, for those today who are artists, who are illustrators, who are writers, who are filmmakers, one of the ways is to create new images. It means that Gal Gadot is not the person to play Cleopatra, if I have to be precise. It is those who have Apple TV. I happen to have gotten a new phone, so I had the Apple TV for a year for free. So I've been able to see Tehran. I don't know when Tehran is going to be released, but whenever it's released, at least you can see the trailer. It's looking at the new Israeli films like Our Boys, which is based on a true story and is depressing, and it's because it's a true story. And looking at the character of Shlomo Elkabetz. Some of you may know Ronit Elkabetz, who died. She died of cancer, but she is famous in the States because of her film, The Band. Yes, so I would say look her up. Those are people who are trying to change images in Israel, but the same can happen in the United States. So one example I gave my students this semester, it's not quite of color per se, was I had them watch the film. I don't recommend or not recommend it, but that is Adam Sandler, who frankly I don't find particularly funny, and his film Uncut Gems. If you can make yourselves watch Uncut Gems, but then look up everything that you can about the Sephardi brothers, their background, and the Jews who they represent in the Diamond District in Uncut Gems. You will discover they're not Ashkenazi, but you'd have to know what small details are in the film to pick that up. That is a very simplistic film, but that is a way that one can think about what are the images that Jews in Iowa see in their Hebrew school books. If they only see images of white children who happen to have a kippah, then of course they're going to think, well, Jews look white. So Queen Esther looks white, but Queen Esther couldn't have looked white, not in the way that we think of it. And Cleopatra didn't look like Gal Gadot. So when I said Tehran, the actors, both women actors, I can't remember their names, either one of them could be playing Cleopatra if we were going to use somebody who was Jewish. So what I'm saying is that the cultural shift also takes place the same way that Jews became white. In the United States, it was with films. Some of you who are older maybe are familiar with Gentleman's Agreement. Any recognition? Crossfire. Gentleman's Agreement received the Oscar. Gregory Peck. If you haven't seen it, do write it down, at least look at it. Those were films that were intentionally made to turn Jews into a religion like Christians and to say they were just like us. Now it's time to begin to create images and films that do the opposite. And I think Spike Lee does it a little bit in Black Klansman, but he chose Adam Driver. So that's not really a good example. And that's the opposite of the Uncut Gems, as I say.
Thank you for that. And I think all of us have our fair share of movies to catch up on. At least I do, I must say. I want to ask a question about the election in the U.S. It's hard to talk about this topic without looking back at what has just occurred in the U.S. And that is, we've seen 4 tumultuous years. It feels as if the country, at least in my lifetime, is more divided than we've been in a very long time. And we're seeing those fault lines largely split, again, this is my own view, among racial lines. Where so much so that a simple statement like Black Lives Matter has become a political statement instead of one of showing empathy and understanding. We are just so divided today. How do we get out of this, what I would call dangerous period in American history? I mean, you talked about a very specific, changing the images to help us better understand the diversity of Jews, but just in terms of, I guess it's a big overarching question, like, how do we get out of this rut?
Well, Black Lives Matter, I think, is an important movement. I have a lot of disagreements with the platforms. And so I'm also older and I can see things in perspective. Look, for me as an Israeli and as a person who lives in the United States and has American citizenship, as well as Israeli citizenship, I'm always seeing the world and spends a lot of time in France. I'm always seeing the world in transnational ways. So I have to come down to earth periodically. The reality in the United States at the moment is that it is young Black men and women who, because of racist attitudes in people's minds, who have their hand on the gun, it is easy to shoot black skinned, brown skinned people. That's a reality. And that reality is now on screens around the world. And around the world includes Israel. There's no way to avoid the discussion of Palestinian lives or of Ethiopian and Palestinian Israelis. That's just a reality. Now, how do we confront it? I think that one of the ways not to confront it is to say, okay, yes, but, and provide counter examples. It is rather to understand the dynamics of how American racism functions, is institutionalized, and has always been institutionalized, first of all, to rejecting Americans of African descent, which is the language of the law. I mean, Americans of African descent were not described by how they look like. They were described by ancestry. I know it's late and it's difficult to simplify, but because people do not remember, although it's come back into the news most recently, that the Brown versus Board of Education overturned a very important Supreme Court decision. So bear with me while I give a reminder. And that is Homer Plessy versus Ferguson, which was in the 1860, I just forgot the 1868, around there. It's post-Civil War. And Homer Plessy was a white-looking colored person of Louisiana who arranged with the railroad to get on the newly segregated railroad and sit in the whites-only section. If he didn't tell the railroad that he was not a white person, they wouldn't have known, which was the point of the suit, of the example. And he sat in the colored person section and was arrested. That went all the way to the Supreme Court, which decided that separate was equal. He appealed that and said his reputation had been damaged and therefore he deserved monetary compensation. And the Supreme Court rejected that because he was a resident of Louisiana. And in Louisiana, a colored person was defined as 1/32nd Negro ancestry. That became part of property law. The point here is that that history is important to know, but what's important today is not that a white-looking person who is of African descent can be lynched, it's that a brown body on the street can be shot, is seen as suspicious. That does not exclude the fact that in terms of numbers, there are more white young people who were shot by police. It's the disproportionate number of young Black people who are being shot indiscriminately. And you know, there are other countries where other groups who are seen as numerical minorities, without power, are also targeted discrimination. So I think that we have to accept that, we have to work with that. And again, Jewish diplomats are going to have to deal with the Palestinian-Israeli issue and both show convergences, but also differences. And one way to do that is to work with, if it's in the context of Israel, it's to work with peace groups that are Israeli peace groups that are based in Israel, not just outside. As far as the divide in the country, the divide here is as bad here as it is in some other places. And again, for me, it's Israel. I went and I voted the second time. We had tickets to vote the third time, and then the pandemic struck, and 2 days before we were to leave, which was a week before voting, we canceled our tickets. Israel is also very divided. We have a government that is not necessarily representative of the country. There's a half and half divide, and here there's a half and half divide. In terms of anti-Semitism and racism per se, how do we make those bridges? We cannot, I say we, for those who believe in social justice and believe in equal opportunity, at least, which is there are many ultra-Orthodox who have been vocally supportive of Trump. There is the Prime Minister of Israel, who was not just vocally supportive of Trump, but made a point of being supportive of Trump and being unsupportive of President Obama. Media today translates, Google Translate translates everything. That means that it is easy for those who are not sympathetic to Israel and not sympathetic to Jews to focus in on Jewish racism. I don't think that we necessarily have to buy into that and spend a lot of time on that, but the work countering it should not just be reactive, it should also be proactive. So the reality is nobody has an answer for this moment in time. I've started watching news twice a day, NPR in the morning, 5:30 Lester Holt, and the rest is paper or online paper. We don't have an answer for that. What we know is that Jews have to represent, we have to represent ourselves as a people and not just a religion. Some people are ultra-Orthodox, some are secular. We have to represent ourselves as a people who transcend all social science categories, that none of them fit us. And that while not everybody's a good human being, at least we accepted a covenant to be to try to be better than others in our behavior, in the standards that we hold to ourselves.
I want to turn it in the little time we have left back to another JD. Shauna, did you have your hand up? And would you like to ask a question? Great.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mevorach. You're an amazing speaker, and I love listening to you. And it's got to be very amazing is the best word I could think of, but it's the wrong word, to be at the intersectionality of the divides that are going on right now. As somebody who's very, very active on social media, and also I'm a world-renowned yoga instructor, so most of my audience is very, very liberal and very, very anti-Israel. I'll just put it right out there. As somebody who's very outspoken in my pro-Israel viewpoints, you talk about that we cannot ignore the issue of the Palestinians when it comes to Black Lives Matters and the issues that we're going through in America. What I found is that in my community, and again, it's a large following, thank you, Sarah, that there has been a profound vilification of me as a Jew, when my message has been, Jews have been lockstep with the Black community since the beginning of the civil rights era. right? We helped found the NAACP. We walked with Martin Luther King. Like, this has always been a shared, I don't even want to say oppression. I don't want this to be a race to the bottom. But how do I support Israel vocally, because it is the deepest part of my heart, without being vilified as a racist? And where do you think that all the anti-Semitism that came out of this Black Lives Matter movement, is it because of the Palestinian conflict? Or why was there such a vocal anti-Semitic element, especially on Twitter? And thank you again for your time and for your brilliant statements.
I empathize with you. I sympathize with you. I empathize and sympathize. I don't have an answer. I mean, there's certain conversations I avoid. There's certain conversations I walk away from. Always have. It doesn't interest me. You can talk to a wall, and you can spend your whole day pushing at the wall, talking to the wall is not going to move. Some conversations are pointless because there's no interchange, there's no exchange. The person has already made up their mind. And I will share this. I've been reading Frantz Fanon since I was, since the 70s, since the late 60s. I have the old book that you can't even find, the old translation with Sartre's introduction. When I was in Paris in 2006, somebody said, "Oh, do you know that Fanon has a daughter?" I said, "No, I didn't." Well, it turns out that she'd been a well-kept secret, but that now a book was written and it's all out. So we met at an evening at somebody's party, and our conversation lasted for maybe 75 seconds.
Oh.
That was about it. She's a friend of Hezbollah.
Ah, okay.
There was no conversation. I said, "Oh, you want to start with 1967? What about 1948?
Right.
Okay, from Benny Mars today, we know that the story isn't just a wonderful story of Ben Gurion and others with the, what do you call it, the horn saying, please stay in the villages. That's not true. I want to say this. There's a reckoning going on in many communities. It is healthier in some ways in other countries than in this country. The problem with the nostalgia narrative, and I was born and raised in New York City. I'm first generation American. My children were born I had them in Israel. And so only my daughter has acquired citizenship. The others had to wait and go through the regular process. But the narrative of nostalgia, there was no nostalgia. Think of the people that we don't talk about. We don't talk about Lisa Jones, who is the daughter of Hetty Cohen and Amir Barak, who started out as Leroy Jones. We don't talk about Paul Robeson and Paul Robeson Jr. and his Jewish wife and their children, who are well known in their circle. We don't represent all the different people who occupy or are socially positioned in multiple places. And the Black Lives Matter generation, whether they are Black, and now I mean Black, not necessarily Jewish, although one of the spokespersons is Black and Jewish and extremely anti-Israel. And one of Jeremy Corbyn's closest allies is British, Black, and Jewish. And I don't mean a convert. I mean somebody who is halachically Jewish, so there's no question there. So as I say, there's some things that are meaningless. To speak about the alliance ignores the fact that that alliance was owned with some people. I've shown my students 2 documentaries this semester. One, Yittel in the Middle, about Jews in Iowa, and one, Delta Jews in Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta. They were horrified, and they didn't even have a real Jewish identity. At the end of the semester, they were talking about their Jewish identity. The Jews that were featured in the Mississippi film, they did not want the Jewish civil rights people there. They were horrified when the civil rights workers came. For them, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner were an embarrassment, brought fear to their community. They were happy being quiet Jews, getting along with their Christian neighbors. For the Jews in the Delta, in Iowa, they just were assimilated white Jews. You're describing yourself as Jewish, but to young people and to those who don't know that history, They won't point to the Martin Luther King, Rabbi Heschel Kumbaya. They will point rather to the challenges in the North, and mostly they're speaking about the North. So let me finalize your answer. There is a Northern experience and there is a Southern experience. And the story of shared legacies is also a story about Jews in the North, some of whom felt very alienated from their white suburban parents, new suburban parents. Some of them went to Israel. They did make Aliyah because they got disgusted with everything after the 67, 68, 69. But they went to the South and were allies in the South with Black Americans who understood the biblical analogies. The story in the North is a very different story. And I think there's no simplicity, there's no simple answer, but simply retelling the 60s as the beautiful film. It's a beautiful film, Shared Legacies. I cried. And when I was done, I called a friend of mine who's a dean at a historically Black college. And I said, you know, does this speak to your students? She said, no, it doesn't. It answers questions. It provides answers to questions that are irrelevant to them. And this 1 hour session can't solve it. But the wonderful thing is at least it gets all of us thinking, again, how do we answer Zach's question? How do we answer your question? It's about what strategy do you decide to use that's going to, it's a bad metaphor at this point with the Me Too movement, but that's going to penetrate people's minds. And maybe some you're going to have to forget about. And maybe for others, when Purim comes along, when Hanukkah's about to come along, it's not about Europe. Purim comes next, it's about Persia. Pesach comes, that we're in Egypt. Where do we begin? We begin in the East, we begin in Arabia. Why is there a fight over Abraham's tomb? Everybody knows that Abraham had 2 sons, and it's in the Bible, and they only meet once as grown-ups, and that's when he dies, and they're both at his funeral. And we rarely talk about that. But in Hebrew, a younger generation does not, and younger, under 40, they don't know that those who are over 50 used to say, Habnei Dodim, cousins, sometimes in a pejorative way, but always as a realistic term, cousins, who fight over Abraham's site in, where of all places, Hebron. So how do we accept the fact that we have to tell complex stories, and how do we refuse to simplify? By telling these stories.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And I do realize we're at time, but if you have time for one more question, I'd love to turn it over to Sarah.
I'm in Iowa. For me, it's early.
Excellent. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you so much for these amazing remarks that you gave us. As you can hear, I have a different accent because I am from Mexico and I am speaking from Mexico. And I understand that, you know, racial identity can change depending on the background where you are. So for example, here in Mexico, I have white privilege because my skin is lighter and I have the privilege of the white minority who lives in Mexico. But when I lived 15 years in the United States, I was Latina, you know? So I understand that racial identity can change from depending on the place in the world you are and in the minority that you happen to be at that moment. My question is more about saying, you know, about Jewish privilege. Not about whiteness, but with the concept of privilege. And the concept of privilege as something with a negative connotation. So I think that that's what scares me. Then when other people see us that we have that privilege, and I'm sorry to say this, but I don't feel like they share the same empathy for our community when we are struck with anti-Semitism. I mean, I don't want to say it's not about race because I know it is about race, but the word for me that has a key connotation, it's privilege. And privilege is something that really has a connotation that, you know, since you have your privilege, I'm not going to be there for you if you need us, or I'm not going to show support because you have all this privilege. That's the word that scares me about this process that we're living.
No,
So
I
I don't
think
know if there's a question there or not.
I think that one of the questions that you're saying is that once we say, oh, Jews have privilege, then automatically Jews are, okay, so then Jews are outside of, in the American context, outside of the umbrella, people of color. And when I always say, I have a big mouth, being Jewish and Jamaican background. So I will say, what do you mean what do you mean when you say people of color? Do you hear Palestinians say, I'm a white Palestinian, I'm a white Arab? You never hear that. But there are plenty of Palestinians, including the actor who's now gaining familiarity in American audiences, Mohammed Bakri, okay, as an example. When on campuses, and you have this experience then, especially in the Midwest, I don't know on the East and West Coast, a little bit, it's different because there's more diversity, but Jewish student groups. So there'll be Jewish student groups, there'll be, oh, the Latina group are meeting with the Jewish group, with nobody ever thinking that, wait a minute, some of the Latino are Jewish. Did you ask? You know? So privilege has come to be associated until recently, because it's being challenged again. But privilege was being associated with whiteness, under the whiteness studies, under critical race theory. And my argument in terms of academia, which then trickles into the popular sphere, because the young people are hearing popular terms coming out of the academic world. Once privilege is associated with whiteness, we forget that privilege also has class terms, and that privilege functions in different ways. And Frantz Fanon, for instance, understood that. All the old socialist thinkers understood, including Zev Jabotinsky. I was just reading The Iron Wall, where he would be horrified by the nation state law of Israel, but understands that you can have privilege in one context, but in another context, absolutely no privilege. And you just described one way in which that functions, just on an individual level. So perhaps when the term privilege is being used, it can't just be thrown out there. It has to be contextualized in a given moment. As a Black woman, as a brown-skinned person in Grinnell, Iowa, the assumption is that if you're Black and you're in Grinnell, Iowa, you either belong to the hospital or the college, because that's what there is. There's no other reason to be there. Even that is changing. Obama and his children are privileged, but they're not so privileged when they go into the street. Somebody who looks white and is wearing a kippah and tzitzim and looks like an ultra-Orthodox Jew walking in Crown Heights does not have privilege walking the streets, but does have political privilege when he calls the police. That's what I mean about the complexity. Everybody wants to simplify. And to answer what Logan asked before, it just seems to me that because we have been simplifying and simplifying and simplifying and not wanting to say complexity and working with terms like identity and identity politics, we've been moving further and further away from the reality that every group and individuals within a group have complex social positions. And if I don't allow my students to say race as a noun, I force them to say race as a verb, which means they don't say it at all. They find other ways to talk about racism, which is the conversation. To talk about anti-Semitism is to say anti-Semitism takes away, it eats away at the privilege. So if you have $100 and I have $100, but I'm white Anglo-Saxon or Mexican Catholic, then I've got 100, but you actually only have 99, because it's going to eat away. So we all have to come up with the examples in the moment. But yes, you should be concerned, we should be concerned of how the term is deployed. And that's why in the very beginning I said that it requires a lot of thinking and conversations of this sort among different groups of people, but all with the same intent, not just with everybody. So this is a Jewish conversation. So in a Jewish conversation, it's saying, okay, how do we deal with the issue of privilege, with positionality, with being American as opposed to being Algerian Jewish, with going to Israel and having perfect English, as opposed to going to Israel, where Arabic has been demoted in a way that the founders from left to right would have been horrified. But all the Jews who came from Arab countries spoke Arabic. And now there's a second reckoning in Israel of Mizrahi Jews who are also writing for the American Academy and writing only about racism in Israel with American eyes, which means that the complexity and the contradictions of that early period in Israel are disappearing. Some of you will have seen or may see Jewish films, the Jewish Film Festival, and one of the films you may see is Ma'abarot. And if you do, it's on the tent camps. If you do see the film, then you will see that it is not the beautiful story of the melting pot, of the bringing together of the exiles, as some of us grew up with. There's a pendulum. So yes, be concerned with the term privilege, define your terms, but don't be afraid of it. I think that's probably what I'm saying. You don't have to be afraid of the term privilege. You have to take ownership of it and then use it and unpack it. So it's a both and, it's not either or. Anti-Semitism is real. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism. And again, if we go back to Jews are a people, then we can come back to anti-Semitism will affect Jews who are ultra-Orthodox, but they will also affect Jews who think that they're Marxist and they belong to the Socialist Progressive Party until you meet someone like Jeremy Corbyn.
Great. Well, with that, we're well over time. And Professor, I just want to thank you on behalf of JD's for what was a really enlightening discussion. These are undoubtedly complicated issues, and we feel very fortunate to have your expertise to help us navigate it. And thank you to all the JDs who participated and asked questions. So with that, thank you again.